Hey everyone, welcome back to What Can Brown Jazz Vinyl. Before we get started, if you could please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, I would greatly appreciate it. I'm actually coming up on 1,000 at last check, and so it's kind of a big number, kind of a big deal. So if you could go ahead and hit that subscribe button, I would appreciate it. So the topic for today is I don't know, perhaps an underappreciated artist. Maybe not now these days. I feel like in some ways, the appreciation of a musician sometimes these days is misconstrued with the value of their records. And this is a musician whose records have actually increased quite a bit over the years, especially over the last like 5 years or so. In part, I think because of their scarcity, but then also because the music is just so great, and so therefore the albums are quite desirable. So as you can sort of guess, or as you know from the title of this video, the musician that we're talking about today is Dorothy Ashby. So Ashby is an interesting musician in that she was sort of a pioneer of playing the harp in a jazz context. So, certainly well before Alice Coltrane, who is another fantastic jazz harpist. But Ashby was there pretty early on, actually, as early as 1952. She initially started out playing the piano and switched over to harp as her primary instrument, I believe, in 52. So a lot of the conversation about Dorothy Ashby is around this idea that she was the first. And I want to kind of clarify what we mean when we say the first, because it's certainly certainly she was probably the first Black female harpist to play jazz, but I don't think people are talking about that when they say that she was the first. I think what they're talking about is that she was the first harpist to actually incorporate improvisation into her music, rather than just playing in sort of a supporting role within the context of jazz. So there's a number of examples of the usage of harp in jazz music. So there's the Boyd Rayburn Orchestra. If you haven't heard any of Boyd Rayburn's music, I actually highly suggest you check out his 10-inch releases for Savoy, which actually I think were released initially on shellac, like 78 RPM disc, but the more available versions of that, right, are on 10-inch vinyl on the Savoy label. Really great stuff. If you like Mingus, you'll like Boyd Rayburn's stuff. Dizzy Gillespie actually had a harp at one point in his orchestra. I'm not sure for exactly how long, but he was incorporating some of these interesting instruments. So let's see. I mean, there was a variety of musicians who were playing harp in a jazz context. You have Corky Hale, who put out an album for what was it, the GNP label, and it was titled Modern Harp. Let's see. She also played on a Pacific Jazz date with Chet Baker. It was one of those where it was like Chet Baker plays the arrangements of like Russ Freeman or something like that, that Corky Hale plays on. She also played with like Kitty White and was in her backing band. Betty Glayman or Glaman, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce her name. She was a harpist. She had a Bethlehem album that was put out in, I want to say, 1955, which is actually really great. You should check that one out too. And then she had a album for Mercury as well. She played with Duke Ellington. She played with Marion McPartland, all kind of in the mid-50s. So thus far, anyway, each of these examples are kind of around the same time, at least, that Ashby is coming to be. But there were a few very early examples. So there was a harpist named Casper Reardon, who played with Jack Teagard in the 30s. There was Adele Girard, who played, she played harp. I want to say she was married to a clarinetist, and the two played and actually recorded together in the 30s and 40s. So she was playing harp. But again, there wasn't really that much of this kind of improvisational sort of nature to a lot of that earlier music. It was brought much later. And so I do think that when we say Dorothy Ashby was the first, I think what we're talking about is that she was the first, or at least among the very first musicians to bring the harp into this sort of jazz improvisational context. And like I said, as early as 1952, she was playing. So very much on the scene at the right time in order to sort of help craft the direction, I think, of the music. So what I want to cover today is not her entire discography, because I don't want to make this a really long video, but I actually do intend to cover her entire discography, at least as a leader. What I'm going to do with this video actually is I'm going to sort of separate this out into almost like a part one, part two. Part two may be tackled like later, like in a few weeks or something. It's not going to like, come right after necessarily. We'll have to see. But what I want to talk about today is her first 5 albums, which carry us from, let's see, her earliest was 1957 for the Regent label. And I think the last one I want to cover today was this one right here, The Fantastic Jazz Harp of Dorothy Ashby, which I want to say was 1961 or 62. And so we're gonna cover these 5 initially, and then in a future video I'll tackle her Argo release, her Cadet releases. It's actually a very natural transition, not only in terms of there being like several year gap in between what I'm going to cover now versus later, but also stylistically. I think early on she was trying to play in a certain way that kind of meshed with what was happening in jazz for some of these labels, and I think later on she really was able to develop a distinctive voice, and I think was better able to sort of I don't know, craft what new music was sounding like at that time. So I think it's going to be a natural transition. Again, today we're going to tackle the early period of Dorothy Ashby's career. All right, so the first one we're going to tackle is actually her debut. Makes sense. We're starting from the beginning. And her debut as a leader is simply called the Jazz Harpist. This one happens to be for the Regent label. Not a lot of folks, I suppose, are that familiar with the Regent label. It's been described as like a budget sort of subsidiary of Savoy. I don't know that that's the case. At least it isn't evident in terms of like the packaging or certainly the quality of music, because there's some really great stuff on Regent. But in any event, they are affiliated. I do believe that Savoy owned Regent, at least at this time. They probably bought Regent at some point, because I want to say Regent was doing like 78s pretty early on, possibly as its own separate label. I didn't do all of that research, I apologize, but you can look it up. So this one is her debut. She is joined here by Frank Wess. He's going to be a repeating presence on some of her albums. You have Wendell Marshall, as well as Eddie Jones, who are sort of tag teaming bass. I want to say they each take half the tracks. And then you have Ed Thigpen on drums. One other sort of noteworthy thing about this album is that the audio engineer on this is Rudy Van Gelder, who also worked on some of her other albums, which is great, because who else, if you're a pioneer on an instrument in jazz, who else do you want recording you other than Rudy Van Gelder? So about this album, this one was put out in 1957. Generally speaking, the harp here, I would say, is best when it's used for melody and accompaniment. And that statement goes completely against some of my opening sort of preamble about Dorothy being such a pioneer in terms of incorporating jazz improvisation. Well, she does incorporate jazz improvisation here, but it's a little bit uneven, in my opinion. So the only horn here is the flute. It's Frank Wess's flute. And I actually think that the two sort of complement each other very well. And actually, because that's the only horn, she's able to break through the other musicians a little bit better than, say, if she was being accompanied by like a saxophonist and and a trumpet player, right? So what's created here is this kind of chamber jazz feel to some extent, because it is so quiet. There's no piano player. The only melody instruments really here are, again, harp and flute. From that standpoint, the balance is great. She does a great job establishing melody, and she does a great job of comping when Frank Wess is playing some of his flute solos. The problem is so the opening track is called "Thou Swell," and it's at a pretty frenetic pace, so it's pretty quick. And I mentioned that that she doesn't necessarily do as great of a job here in improvisation, at least not consistently. The harp on this track is pretty clunky in terms of Ashby's solo. So the pace is so fast, and especially some of the lower register sort of plucking notes that she does, they all just sort of like blend together, and it's kind of hard to hear exactly when she's playing the notes. And how that manifests itself in terms of actually listening to it is that it sounds like she is like so far behind the beat, like not just laid back swinging, but like just late. So it's kind of distracting actually on this opening track. When you listen to her solo, you're like, wait, is she not playing in time? Is that like intentional? And I can't, I can't necessarily say that she isn't playing in time, at least in terms of when her fingers are plucking the strings, but how it materializes, at least audibly, is that she's not playing in time on this opening track, Thou Swell. Now, fortunately for all of us, and for all of us who want to listen to this album, that problem doesn't persist on every single track. And so it does get better, especially on some of the tracks that are a little bit slower. She doesn't feel the need this early to incorporate that many notes in her solos, which I think is probably smart given some of the problems with that first track that is so fast. But I think what she does establish is that she still has interesting ideas. She's certainly a stellar musician. That certainly comes across. I just think that this is her debut, and it's clear to, at least, I want to say it's clear because that makes it seem like it's clear for everybody. In my opinion, this opening debut album is just a little bit uneven, but it sure shows plenty of promise and is definitely an enjoyable listen. All right, this next one is from 1958, so just the following year from that Regent title, and that is Hip Harp. This is on the Prestige label. So similar to the Jazz Harpist for Regent, she's joined here by Frank Wess on flute, but Herman Wright is on bass, and then you have Art Taylor on drums. Also similar to the previous album, this one was recorded by Rudy Van Gelder. So there are some distinct differences, I think, with this album compared to the other. First and foremost, the harp just sounds a whole lot crisper in terms of her attacks, in terms of how she's playing the harp. She, at times, I think whereas the previous one, it just felt like a harp. It felt like more of a traditional instrument being played in a jazz context. In this one, she almost plays the harp a bit like a guitar. In certain ways, in terms of like plucking individual strings hard, as opposed to this kind of delicate touch that you might expect from a harp, or as opposed to that sort of cascading kind of like almost like, arpeggios or like chord runs, right, that a harp might do when they're strumming lots of strings and kind of going, in and out. Like I'm not a harpist, and I haven't studied I don't even know how it's played or how you would call it, but you know what I'm talking about, that kind of like, sort of cascading lines, right? So interestingly enough, she seems to have slightly adopted her style of playing a bit, I think, to the subject matter. And it could be that on the Prestige label, it could be that the producers had a little bit more control in terms of the content that she would be playing, that might have sort of forced her in a particular direction in terms of style. I would say that on this album, her solos are still somewhat reserved, at least more so than what you might expect from like again, horn. I keep saying horn, by the way, and what I mean by like horn is like the sort of the leader, the dominant voice in terms of melody on the album. So I understand that a harp is not a horn, and a flute is not a horn either. I mean, it's it's a wind instrument, right? But in this context, I think you know what I mean when I say horn. So where was I? So she's still reserved on this album, at least in terms of her pace, the pace of the tracks that she chose, or that the producers chose for this particular album. So she isn't playing rapid lines, but at the same time, she seems to be a little bit more calculated in what she does play. And I think that her ideas are probably better expressed here in terms of her solos than they were on the previous album. One kind of fun thing, and I'm trying to remember, it is on, I think it's on Pocky, which is the opening track, also one that she wrote. She wrote 3 of the tracks here, I believe. So that's kind of nice to kind of get some of her sort of compositional talent represented here. But on this opening one, Pawky, Pawky, there's kind of this fun thing where she incorporates a quote from a famous song into her solo, which a lot of musicians did, right? And she incorporates a line from the opera Carmen. And it's kind of fun not only to hear that and to sort of hear her having fun with, you know, again, incorporating other music into her solos, but then later on, Herman Wright, when he has his bass solo, he also incorporates a line from Carmen as well. So it's kind of fun to see that these musicians, even in this almost like, you know, sort of quiet, sort of sparing sort of dynamic in terms of the instrumentation, that they're still having fun with the music, and they're still sort of taking, you know, getting inspired from each other. So the second track on this album is called "Dancing in the Dark." "Dancing in the Dark" is pretty like shockingly beautiful. Like it's a really, really interesting track, and one that I wouldn't have expected to hear on a Prestige album. So Ashby opens with this sort of like repeating kind of almost guitar-ish line that Frank West solos over. And I think that, you know, the danger here is that it starts to sound a little bit less like jazz and a little bit more like classical music, or maybe something that might accompany a film score, say. Now, let's be real, like the term jazz is kind of problematic here, as it is, and most musicians reject the term, right? And sort of being boxed into what other people think their music should sound like. The bottom line here, independent of any of that, is that it's really great track. Like it's just really good music, and I think that that's enough. You know, it happens to be on a Prestige album. Feels a little bit out of place, but at the same time, it's a really nice highlight of her ability to play the harp in a variety of styles, and like I said, it's just like really, really beautiful. I think if there's any takeaway from this album as a whole, I think you need to go seek out "Dancing in the Dark." I'm not sure if it's available to stream, but try to check that one out, and you can see what I mean. All right, moving right along in chronology. This next one is called "In a Minor Groove." So this one was also recorded in 1958, just like this Prestige one. This was put out on the Prestige subsidiary, New Jazz. And you can kind of tell that like these would have been about the same time period, because catalog number here, 7140. New Jazz kind of started right around the same time that that the labels switched from New York to New Jersey, which was title or catalog number 7142, which was Soul Train by John Coltrane, and this is right at the beginning of the New Jazz catalog, right? 8209, because 8201 was the first one. So in any event, you can just kind of tell even from the catalog numbers that these would have been around the same time period, and it turns out they were both put out in 1958. So there you have it. So on this album, we have a few familiar faces. Frank West is back again. We have Herman Wright on bass, who also played bass on Hip Harp. On this one, we have Roy Haynes instead of Art Taylor on drums. So this album is really the standout of these early albums that Dorothy Ashby put out, and I think it's for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, the sound quality is definitely the best thus far. Rudy Van Gelder is also the engineer on this one, of course. And yet the harp here sounds just the best of any of the albums, of these three albums that I've covered so far. The tone is brighter. It feels like it's brought forward more, like you can hear the harp just simply better. The brushwork by Roy Haynes also feels like it's much more prominent and is a better blend. And it just feels crisper. Like he sticks to brushes mostly, right? Because you can't be playing sticks on, you can't be playing like snare or something when you have a harp who's trying to break through that, right? So Roy Haynes plays a lot of brushes here, but there just feels like there's a lot more detail behind them compared to some of these other earlier albums. So everything about this particular album is better in terms of how it sounds. Now, in terms of the music, so there's 8 tracks here. The pace is generally quicker than some of the more sort of somber stuff of some of her earlier albums. She still isn't filling, she's not worried about filling all the space with a ton of notes, but she does play more notes in these tracks than she does in the other two albums, generally speaking. I would also say that her playing style feels more developed. So she feels, I think it's maybe that she feels more comfortable playing the blues, which is kind of the theme here. So I think that the highlight track on this album is probably Taboo, which is the second track to appear on the first side. Really nice both harp and bass solos here. The melody line is something that Frank West handles, and that's really nice. Again, I think Roy Haynes' brushwork is such a standout on this album, and it just sounds really crisp and interesting in terms of how he uses the brushes for fills on this particular track. So one quick note, I mentioned that blues, and it makes sense, right? That the title of the album is fairly descriptive of what you're going to find on the record. So in a minor groove, and so what you have is just much more of a minor feel here across all of these tracks, right? So it's blues progressions, sort of Aeolian scales, that kind of thing. And so I think if what you're looking for is something that fits better into the jazz box, then it's this. Compared to these other two albums that I've already covered, it doesn't really stray into other territory as much as some of those other ones do. Now, it probably didn't do that well in any event. I mean, despite how great it sounds, and despite that it's a little bit more sort of squarely jazz in style. But this would be Ashby's last album for Prestige or New Jazz. And there actually would be a hiatus in terms of her playing. I don't want to say playing, I'm sure she was playing, but a hiatus in recorded albums, because this was 1958 and her next one wouldn't be until 1961, which is the next one that we're going to talk about. All right, so the fourth album of 5 for this video, and that is Soft Winds. So this is an album that was put out in 1961. It was put out on the Jazzland label. Jazzland was a Riverside subsidiary, which is kind of an interesting trend here, right? Because we started out with Regent, which is part of Savoy. We ended up getting into the New Jazz title, In a Minor Groove, which is part of Prestige. Here we are with Jazzland, which is a Riverside label. So here we have a kind of an interesting lineup, actually. So Herman Wright is back on bass. We have Jimmy Cobb on drums. And then we have Terry Pollard, who plays vibes here. Terry Pollard was a piano player, but she was also a vibist. She had an album for Bethlehem that was actually, I think it was a 10-inch record that is actually very worthwhile. You should check that one out. But anyway, a kind of an interesting lineup. And the liner notes of this album actually make a really big deal about this idea that there are 2 women on this album. And at the same time that having to say that feels a little bit old-fashioned, it actually is quite a bit unusual to have one, let alone 2 female musicians. Neither one are vocalists on a jazz album. And so, yeah, it's kind of interesting. I actually think that the 2 play off each other very, very well on this album, and I think it's interesting, especially to hear the harp and vibes combo. So thus far in the 3 albums that we've talked about so far, we've had that flute, Frank West's flute on each of them, and so here we finally got rid of him. No offense to him, because I think he actually did a really good job, but I think it's nice for just from a variety standpoint to hear that at this stage in Dorothy Ashby's playing, that she was playing with a vibraphonist. So the choice of material here does include some movie themes. I want to say there's like 3 of them. There's a variety of standards as well. And then I think that there's only one original composition that Ashby contributed, and that is called With Strings Attached. So one general complaint about this album is that there are 11 songs, and 9 of them clock in at less than 3 minutes. So tangibly, what that means is that there's less time to get out of the melody and into interesting solo work. Now, at the same time, I actually think that that the soloists, mostly Pollard and Ashby, do just a really stellar job here in the time that they're allotted to provide interesting solos. I would just wish that each of these could be extended. I mean, I'd be fine with 5 or 6 tracks on this, and double the length of each of them, just so we could get more into that, right? But that's not what they did here, and it is what it is. One thing that I do want to point out here, that sort of contradicts one of my early, or resolves one of my early complaints from actually that first album for Regent, where I said she was having a hard time playing fast. So here, if you listen to the track called "The Man I Love," I want to say it's track 3. It feels like that track could be taken at like 130, maybe 140 beats per minute. I didn't get out a metronome. It just I was listening to it, and I was like trying to think, and I was like, oh man, this is pretty quick. And Ashby shows that she's very comfortable playing at that accelerated pace at this point. And it's a really nice feature of hers, I think, that particular track, "The Man I Love." Whereas some of the other tracks on this album, such as "Wild as the Wind," is very much a vibes feature. Now, again, I mentioned that the tracks are less than 3 minutes. You can't have equal treatment, equal time in terms of solos being given to both horns on every track. So not necessarily any complaints here. It's just that there's some tracks that feature Pollard, and there's some tracks that feature Ashby. All right, so this last one, I'm actually gonna have to apologize. This entire video, or not this entire video, up until this the previous clip where I was talking about the Jazzland title, I've had the fantastic jazz harp of Dorothy Ashby on Atlantic up on this thing behind me this entire time, and that's not one of the first 5 in her catalog. I actually, when I was looking through them, I thought I knew the chronology, and apparently I didn't. I put that one up. That's 1965. We're still here in 1962. For some reason, I thought the Cadet and the Argo were like the exact same time period. That's not the case. Anyway, apologize for the mistake. Instead, we're just going to pull forward the album that I thought we were going to talk about in part 2 of this thing to now. And that is Dorothy Ashby's, well, it's her self-titled record for Argo. So that is the 5th one that we're going to talk about, and the last one we're going to talk about in this first sort of Ashby appreciation edition. So this one was put out in 1962. It was recorded in 61, the prior year. Again, we have Herman Wright on bass. And we actually have a guy named John Tooley on drums. I'm actually not familiar with John Tooley, but he sounds great here. And anyway, that's it. It's a trio. This is the first of her albums where she's in a trio format. And so there's no horns to support her, which is really interesting. But also, guess what? This is her best one of these 5 by far, I think. So let's see where to start. There are 2 original compositions on this album that Ashby wrote, but the rest are standards. But I think that the standards that she chose are actually really nice ones. You have Satin Doll, which was a Ellington tune, right? I don't think Strayhorn did that. I think that's an Ellington tune. You've got Django, which was John Lewis from MJQ, right? I think wrote Django. And then you have You Stepped Out of a Dream. Actually don't recall. It probably says it here. It does. Lane Washington. No, those aren't familiar names. But anyway, You Stepped Out of a Dream is very much a familiar tune. Everybody has tackled that one. So let's see. Lonely Melody is the opening track of this album, and I think it sets a really nice mood. So obviously Ashby has to take on not just melody but also solos here, because it's difficult to. There are bass solos and she supports them, but she really is the sort of the singular soloist otherwise on this album, and I think that the sound quality is very apparent on this opening track. And it helps establish that mood. So as much as I said that I really enjoyed the sound quality on Inner Minor Groove, and I thought that Rudy did a really good job. This is, obviously Rudy's not, did not support this album for Argo, but the sound quality is just really stellar, and every bit of the mood that I like that Lonely Melody sets, I think is very much accentuated by just how great it sounds. The next track 2, is also a highlight, and this is one where John Tooley, the drummer, shifts over to hand drums. I mean, probably congas. But anyway, shifts over to congas for the opening, and then he kind of goes to the kit, and then he goes back to congas, and then he goes back to the kit. And I actually think that it's a really nice sort of vibe that's set, especially in this trio format. It works really, really well. And again, I hadn't heard hand drums set against Ashby's harp in the past, and I think it works really, really well. And this is also just another track. I think that was a perfect choice in terms of something that sounds almost like it was made for harp. And you could almost say that, gosh, about almost every track on this album. It just feels like it was put together so much better than some of these others, where maybe Ashby was sort of being forced to play certain types of music or certain styles. And I'm not going to say that she chose everything on this album. I don't know that was the case, or I don't know the situation, but it feels like the material is much more complementary to the harp here, and it just feels like just like a better fit. And I think that materializes in the confidence that Ashby has in her playing. She just sounds more confident on almost every single track. In my opinion, this album should have launched her career. So as much as she had these other ones, right, I've already, said this, there was a couple-year gap here and there. Well, guess what? This was recorded in 1961. It was put out in 1962, and she didn't have another recorded appearance until 1965. So it didn't happen. This album did not launch her career, and it's unfortunate, but what is fortunate, at least in retrospect, is that it's such a great album. I mean, I can say certainly that this self-titled album for Argo is my favorite of these 5 that I've covered in this video. If I was going to say, my second favorite, it would have to be In a Minor Groove, and I won't rank the rest because I just think that they're all worth hearing. But anyway, yeah, it's just kind of it's an interesting sort of first 5 albums, and again, I think that what unites them is a little bit of this story, this progression that kind of leads into some of the more, in my opinion, interesting things that she did into the mid-60s, and that includes her albums for Cadet. It includes her participation on some of the Soulful Strings albums. And anyway, that'll be the topic for part 2 when I get to it. But I hope you enjoyed part 1. I hope that you have a few tracks now that you can look up and stream, or look up on YouTube and listen to, because I think that Dorothy Ashby is, like I said at the beginning, is she underappreciated? Well, her albums aren't, because they go for a lot of money, but I do think that she is underappreciated as a musician with a unique voice. It just so happens to have been on harp, and yeah, I think everybody should listen to more of her music. So hope you enjoyed the video. If you still haven't hit the subscribe button, go ahead and hit it now, and I will see you next time.